Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf, which is YOMA Lamed Beis. We begin 3 lines from the top of the Amid. Says the Gemara Tana Rabbanan, we learned in a Brisa. There is a pasuk in Parshas Achemais which says as follows: Uba Aaron el Oyel Moed. Aaron will arrive at the Oyel Moed, at the Heichel, at the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And the pasuk does not explain the reason for his arrival. Lama Huba. What's the purpose of him coming there? The pasuk doesn't say what type of avodah, what type of korban he's coming for. Apparently, the reason for his coming is as follows: he's simply coming back to retrieve his kaf, his machta, his spoon, his shovel, which were used for the ketores, which he brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim earlier in the day. So Uba Aaron El Oyel is simply, he's returning to retrieve his kaf v'machta out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. V'chola parsha kula ne'emra ala seder. Says the Brisa, you're meant to know, if you focus on the psukim throughout this parsha, Parshas Achemais, which describe the karbanos, the various avodas conducted by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, you'll notice that everything is in its proper order. Everything was said in its proper sequence, except for this pasuk, the one that we just mentioned. My time. How do you know it's out of order? Amar of Chizda, I'll explain to you. Gimbiri, we have a Kabbalah, Halacha Moshe Sinai, that there were a total of 5 tefillos and 10 times Kiddush Yodayim V'Raglayim that the Kohen Gadol conducted on Yom Kippur. 5 tefillos, V'asara Kiddushin, Toiva Kohen Gadol, Umekadosh, Boy Bayim. On that day of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol did 5 tefillos and 10 times Kiddush Yodayim V'Raglayim. And when did these things take place? When he would switch over from one type of avodah to another, from one location to another, from one set of begadim to another. For instance, if you would switch from avodas chutz, the karbanos brought outside the Azorah area, which were done wearing bigdei zahav, his full attire, 8 begadim which contained gold kalim as well, and he would be finished and switch over to bigdei lavan in preparation for the avodas pnim. The korban is conducted inside in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That transition, that switchover, would require a tefillah and twice Kiddush Yodayim V'Raglayim. So that's the Halacha Moshe Sinai. Continues Rav Chizda, V'ika Sidron. If those psukim in Parshas Achemais are meant to be taken literally, they were stated in order. If that's the case, you won't find a total of 5 tefillos. You won't find 5 switchovers. You'll only find 3 switchovers, which account for 3 tefillos, v'shisha kedushin. So we 3 switchovers, 3 tefillos, with each tefillah accompanied with by 2 kiddush yadayim raglayim, for a total of 6 kiddush. So instead of 5 tefillos and 10 kiddushin, you'll have only 3 tefillos and 6 kiddushin. Why is that? Explains Rashi. Because in Parshas Achemais, the way the psukim are organized, we find as follows. First, the psukim discuss the avodas hayoim, the par v'soyer, which are considered Yom Kippur karbanos, avodas hayoim, exclusive and unique to Yom Kippur, which are done wearing bigdei lavan. They're considered avodas pnim. He takes the dam and he does the hazah all the way inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which requires him to wear fully white. Then the psukim take you over to the avodas chutz. He goes out and he does the ayil, his ayil, which was an oila, the eil ha'am, the ram belonging to the which was another type of oila. We discussed the musaf and tamen sheben arbayim, which were all avodas chutz, which were done with bigdei zav. So he begins the day with bigdei zav, of course, taking care of the tamen shel shachar. transitions over to Bigdei Lavan, the Avodas Hayoim discussed in Parshas Achrei Mos, then transitions over to Bigdei Zav to account for the Musafin, the Ayel Ha'am, Tamash Ben Arbaim. So how many transitions do you have in total? Only 3. From Zav to Lavan to Zav, and that's it. Three switchovers, which account for 3 tefillas. Each tefillah having 2 kiddush is a total of 6 kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So it's only 3 and 6 instead of 5 switchovers, 5 tefillas, which are accompanied by 10 kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So something's out of order. Apparently, says the Gemara, this pasuk that we just mentioned, Uba Aaron El Oyel Moed, he returns to get his kaf machta. That pasuk was stated out of order. Meaning, when the pasuk thereafter describes the fact that he went to take care of his ayel, the ayel ha'am, which were 2 karbanos oila, karbanos chutz, done with Bigdei Zav, associated with Yom Kippur, Chavis Hayayim, but not considered avodos hayayim, which are done inside, they're done outside. That description, that ayel of ayel apparently must be cut and pasted, taken out of that bundle. It seems to be bundled together with the Musafin, Tabat Shebin Arbaim. No, that can't be the case. You have to lift that out of there, cut it out of there, and paste it over in the middle of Avodas Hayayim. Right before this pasuk of Uba Aaron El Oyel Moed, coming back to Oyel Moed wearing Bigdei Lavan, of course, which were required to enable him entry into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to get his kaf machta. So right before that, we meant to have the pasuk describing him doing the Ayel V'Aylam, Karbanos Chutz, with Bigdei Zav. This rearrangement will put everything at ease, everything to rest. We'll end up with the right amount of tefillos, the right amount of kiddush. Why? So we'll begin his day with Bigdei Zav, Avodos Chutz, Tamid Shel Shachar. He'll transfer over to Bigdei Lavan to take care of the Avodos Hayayim, Parvis Soyer, whose dam is brought inside to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, as described in the beginning of Parshas Achrei Mos. Then, instead of going straight to the Musaf and Tamash Ben Arbaim, the Ayel V'Aylam, no, we stop with Ayel V'Aylam. So he transitions from Lavan to Zav, those are Avodos Chutz. When he's done the Ayel V'Aylam, he transfers back into Bigdei Lavan. Uba Aaron El Oyel Moed, he comes back to the Kodesh HaKadoshim wearing white to retrieve the kaf machta. Then when he's done that, he will transition over to Bigdei Zav a final time to tend to the Karbanos Musaf, Tabat Sheben Arbaim. These were Avodos Chutz, external Karbanos, wearing Bigdei Zav. So the fact that we cut and pasted this pasuk, the Ayel V'Aylam, and we placed it right before the Ba Aaron El Oyel Moed, gives us an added step in the schedule, another segment, another transition from Lavan to Zav and back to Lavan, which accounts for a total of 5 transitions and 5 tefillos with 10 kiddushim. So, in conclusion, since we rearranged the psukim, we end up with the required amount of tefillos, the required amount of kiddush daim raglayim, because we're going to end up having 5 switches, 5 transitions, because we begin the day with Bigdei Zav, which he wore when he took care of the Tamid Shel Shachar. We switch over to Lavan for the Avodos Hayayim, Avodos Pnim. Now we switch over to the Bigdei Zav to take care of Eloi ve'Elam, and that's only because we transferred that pasuk from where it was situated at the end of the day with the Musafin and Tamash Ben Arbaim, and we took it out of there, we transferred it to here. We proved that it must have been stated out of order. It's meant to belong right here, middle of the day, to split the Bigdei Lavan into 2. So now he went from Lavan to Zav, takes care of the Elu Elam. When he's done that, he switches back into Lavan to take care of the Kaf V'Machta, He goes back to retrieve his kelim. When he's finished that, he switches back to Bigdei Zav to conclude the day. Musafin Atomich ben Abayim. So in total we have 5 transitions from Zav to Lav to Zav to Lava to Zav. Each transition requiring a tefillah with 2 kedushin. So it conforms with Halacha Moshe Sinai, 5 tefillahs, and 10 times Kiddush Yodayim Raglayim. Continues the Gemara, Tanya Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So now we learned based on Halacha Moshe Sinai, there were 5 tefillahs and 10 times Kiddush. But as Tosfos explains, perhaps he just did it all at once. 5 tefillahs and 10 Kiddushin. How do we know that it was associated with specific avodas? It's connected to the switchover between one type of avodah to the other, switching out of certain begadim and switching into others. How do we know it's connected to the schedule in that manner? We're going to have a brisa which describes in great detail the sources, the mikoros, of how we know that the tefillahs were related to the switching out of begadim and switching into new begadim. How do we know they're related to the change of a venue, the avodas chutz, avodas pnim? So with regard to tefillahs, with regard to the twice kiddush, the brisa basically is going to have 2 shittas. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi, they both agree as far as the total number. It's going to be 5 times toivel in the mikveh and 10 times rinsing his hands and feet from the kiyar. The question is simply, where do we learn these things from? Which psukim? That's going to be the next price. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Minayin l'chamish tefillos v'asar kedushin. How do we know regarding these 5 tefillos and the 10 kedushin? Shetoivel kohen gadol umekadesh b'yom. Indeed, that the kohen gadol will do these things throughout Yom Kippur, and that they're connected with dressing and undressing, with avodas chutz and avodas pnim. Talmud learn. Let's take a look at the psukim in Parshas Achrayos. So before we proceed, the next price is going to be based specifically on 3 psukim in Sefer Vayikra, all in Perek Tezayin, Parshas Achrayos. Going to have one pasuk, pasuk Dalet, a pasuk Chav Gimel, and a pasuk Chav Dalet. So pasuk Dalet reads as follows: Ksoines bad kodesh yilbash, u'mechnase bad yual b'sorai. These are the white begadim. U'ba'avnei bad yachker, b'snafes bad yachker. Itznoi, he wears all the 4 big day loven, big day kodesh, v'rachatz ba'mayim es b'sorai levesham. He washes himself when he puts them on. Usually v'rachatz ba'mayim es b'sorai means he's toivel in a mikveh. That's pasuk Dalet. We have pasuk Chagimel. Uba'aron al-oymayid, upashat as big day abad asher lavash. He removes the white begadim. He undresses. Asher lavash b'vayil hakodesh v'nicham sham. Continues the next pasuk. V'rachatz. A rechitza is required on account of the pshit, on account of undress. V'rachatz as psori b'mayim makan kodesh. V'lavash as begadav. He puts on begadav. What's begadav? His ordinary clothing. Your typical big day kohen gadol, which we call the big day zav. We're going to dwell on these 3 psuk, which will provide the makar for the 5 tefillahs and the asara kiddush. Getting back to the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda is looking for the makar. He says, "V'tamud loymar uba'aron el moed upashat es bigdei habad v'rachatz es psorai b'mayim b'makayim kadosh v'lavash es b'gadav v'yotza v'asa." So basically, he's combining pasuk Chav Gimel and pasuk Chav Dalet. This is the makar. Halamanta, you learn from here. Shekalam eshanim avoid lavoida ton tefillah. Whenever you switch from one type of avoida, wearing a certain type of begadim, to another type of avoida, where you switch into a new set of begadim, ton tefillah, a tefillah is in place. Says Rabbi Yehuda, the pasuk which tells us that the fact that he switched into his begadim, v'lavash as begadav, the big day zav, so he switched out of the big day loven, then switched into the big day zav, that is machayev a tefillah. Now, how would he know that when he switched from big day zav to big day loven, he's chayev to be tovel? We're going to get to that in a moment. So this is Rabbi Yehuda's sheet. he learns from Pasuk Chav Gimel / Pasuk Chav Dalet. Amar Rabbi had a different approach. Minayin l'chamesh tefillas, asar kiddushin. Sheteva kohen gadol u'mekalish b'yom. How do we know these halachas? Shenamar, he's going to go back to Pasuk Dalet. K'soines badil kodesh yumash, u'mechnese badil absar, u'ba'avneit badil achka, u'b'misnefes badil itzlef. These are the big day lovin, which he's switching into. Big day kodesh hem. And the pasuk says, "V'rachas b'mayim es b'sar elevation." The fact that he's switching into big day kodesh, white begadim, that requires a tefillah. Halamata, you learn from here. Shekol ha'meshanim avoid la'avoida. Whenever you switch from one avoid to the other, you get dressed with a new set of big day kahuna. Tone tefillah, a tefillah is required. So from here we learn that when you put on the big day lovin, you're meant to be toivel. V'omer, and the pasuk that we just quoted contains the following words. Big day kodesh. What's the point of these words? Big day kodesh. We know they're big day kodesh. Hukshu kol begadim kulan zelazeh. The pasuk is telling us that all begadim, whether it's zav or lavan, they're all connected to each other. They're all on the same level, so to speak. They have the same halacha. And actually, the Gemara later will tell us that Rebbe learns from this limud, big day kodesh, that just as when you switch it to big day lavan, a tefillah is required, as we just had in the pasuk. K'soines bad kodesh yilbash, v'rachatz b'sar b'mayim. Likewise, when you switch to big day zav, a tefillah is required. So he learns both things from pasuk dalet. So again, according to Rebbe, whether you're switching into lavan, switching into zav, a tefillah is required. They both contain the pasuk dalet. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha of a tefillah when you switch into big day zav is learned from pasuk chav gimel chav dalet. How does he know that when you switch into big day lavan, a tefillah is required? The Gemara later will actually tell us it's from the same pasuk as Rabbi, from pasuk dalet, which clearly states that when he's putting on the big day lavan, that the big day lavan, a tefillah is required. So we already have the makar for tefillah. When you switch from one set of gadams to the other, regardless of whether it's into big day zav, big day lavan, you need to be toivel. And the Baisa continues. V'chamesh avodas hein. Let's go through the entire schedule. There were 5 transitions throughout the day. You begin with Talmud Shel Shachar, which were done b'big day zav. They were avodas chutz. You switch over to the avodas hayoim, specifically the Par V'Sar Shem Kippurim, meant to generate kapara, which dam was brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, b'big day lava. Then you go over to the Eloi ve'Eloham. These were Karbanos Oila, Karbanos Chutz, done b'big day zav. You switch over to big day lavan for the Kaf Machta, as we mentioned earlier, Kaf Machta, big day lavan. And finally you have the Tamid, Sheben Arbayim, b'big day zav. So this accounts for all 5 steps. Zav to lavan to zav to lavan to zav. And every switchover, every transition requires a tefillah. According to Rebbe, according to Rabbi Yehuda, just depending on the psukim. Each one had a different approach as to the makar, but the halacha remains the same. So that concludes the first segment of the Brisa. We addressed the chiv tefillah. What about the mitzvah of kiddush yadayim raglayim? U'minayin shekol tefillah u'tefillah tzricha shnei kiddushin. From where do we learn that every tefillah requires twice kiddush yadayim raglayim from the kiyur? Continues Rebbe, Talmud Loimar. Let's go over to pasuk chav gimel chav dalet, which I hadn't yet used for anything. That's fully available to teach us kiddush yadayim raglayim. The pasuk said, Pashat, this is pasuk chav gimel. Pashat es big day habad asher lavash v'vayila kodesh nicham sham v'rachatz. And then the pasuk chav dalet begins with the word v'rachatz. So we darshan that v'rachatz, which is referring to the kiddush yadayim raglayim, refers back to pashat, which tells us that when he undresses, when he switches out of begadim, when he does pshita, he needs kiddush yadayim raglayim. V'rachatz v'lavash. We darshan the same pasuk v'rachatz going forward as well. it applies to pasuk Chav Dalet. The fact that the word v'rachatz is situated between upashat, undressing, and v'lavash, dressing, tells us to apply it in both directions. Apply to the word upashat back in pasuk Chav Gimel, that undressing requires a kiddush yadayim raglayim, and applied forward to pasuk Chav Dalet, which discusses v'lavash as b'gadav. Getting dressed with bigdei kodesh again requires another kiddush. So going to Rebbe, this is where we learn the double kiddush yadayim raglayim. Upashat v'rachatz is the first kiddush on account of undressing. V'rachatz v'lavash is the kiddush on account of dressing the new set of b'gad. Rav Lezer of Shimon Omer has a different source. Kal v'chaymer, we learn kiddush yadayim raglayim not from pasuk Chav Gimel Chav Dalet. Apparently he's following Rabbi Yehuda's approach, who already used those psukim earlier for the halacha of tevilah. So he bases the kiddush yadayim raglayim on a kal v'chaymer. Kal v'chaymer uma b'makim she'ein to'on tevilah, to'on kiddush. Since we find that throughout the year, even though a tevilah is not required upon entry, you don't have to be tovel minat Torah when you enter the Azara. Ain't to'on tevilah, still to'on kiddush. Every kohen knows. You don't approach avodah without kiddush yadayim raglayim. It's a pasuk. You have to rinse your hands and feet from the kiyah. So despite the fact that there's no chiyuv tevilah, there is a chiyuv kiddush. Makim she'to'on tevilah. Certainly, in our case, Yom Kippur, which requires tevilah. For every switch over, for every time he switches out, switches into new begadim, a tevilah is in place, as we just concluded. Ein adin she'to'on kiddush, certainly, kiddush is in place. And we learn from here that when you do tevilah, it has to be accompanied with a kiddush yadayim raglayim. Okay, says the Gemara, we learn one kiddush from here. Im alahalam kiddush echad. Okay, just as over there throughout the year. What does the kohen have to do when he approaches avodah? One kiddush. Avkan kiddush echad. Perhaps here as well, only one kiddush is required. Which kiddush? When he's about to put on his begadim. He puts on the new begadim and washes his hands and feet. How do we know they need another kiddush on account of the removal, on account of undressing the old begadim, on account of switching out? Says the more Talmud Laimar. The pasuk says like this: Uba Aroin El Olimayit Upashad as Bigdei Habad Asher Lavash. This is pasuk Chav Gimel. He switches out of the Bigdei Habad Asher Lavash, which he was wearing. Matam Olam Asher Lavash. What's the point of saying those words? He's taking off the begadim which he was wearing. Klum Adam Poshet Elam Asher Lavash. How then can he remove begadim if not that he was wearing them? So what's the pasuk adding those words? He'll remove the begadim which he was wearing. Ella, apparently the pasuk is telling us a halacha. Lahakish pshita l'levisha. The fact that the pasuk mentions that he's being poshet the begadim which he was lavash. The point is to connect pshita to levisha, switching out to switching in, as follows: Ma levisha to'on kiddush, just as putting on the new begadim, being lavish, the new set of begadim requires a kiddush. How do we know that? Well, we just concluded from a kal v'chaymer that kiddush is in place when he dons the new set of begadim, because since tevilah is needed, when he switches into the new begadim, certainly kiddush is needed. So that's a fact. Just as levisha requires kiddush, af pshita to'on kiddush. Likewise, the fact that he's switching out of the old begadim, that in itself necessitates a kiddush. So we learn this from the pasuk. Upashat as bigdei habad asher lavash. We connect pshita to levisha, just as levisha requires a kiddush. Hu hadin pshita requires a kiddush for a total of twice kiddush yadayim raglayim. So according to this approach, which is Rabbi Lezer of Shimon, the concept of kiddush is learned through a kal v'chaymer. Since throughout the year, a typical Kayan doesn't need tefillah, but he still needs kiddush. Of course, on Yom Kippur, where he requires a tefillah, when he switches into the new begadim, when he approaches the new avodah, of course, kiddush is in place. What about the second kiddush on account of removing the old set of begadim? The fact that the pasuk connects pshita to levisha tells you just as levisha requires a kiddush, likewise pshita. And the Rasul will tell us that Rabbi Yehuda actually will follow this approach because he could not learn from Rebbe's approach. Again, what was Rebbe's approach? Where did he learn kiddush yadayim raglayim? From pasuk chav gimel chav dalet. The fact that it says upashat and then merachatz, merachatz and then melavash. These are pasuk chav gimel chav dalet related words. That teaches us that a rechitza, a kiddush, is required for pshita and for levisha. Rabbi Shimon chose to learn from Kal V'chomer. Apparently, according to Rabbi Shimon, pasuk chav gimel chav dalet were unavailable. It seems like he's following Rabbi Yehuda's shita, who already used chav gimel chav dalet to teach us the halacha of tevilah, as we learned earlier in the Bryce. So bottom line is, when it comes to kiddush yadayim raglayim, we have two approaches as to this source. According to Rebbe, we learn it from pasuk chav gimel chav dalet, upashat v'rachatz v'lavash. According to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, those psukim are unavailable to teach us this halacha. Rather, we base it on Kal V'chomer, which teaches us the kiddush for levisha, kiddush for pshita. We learn as a result of the extra wording in the pasuk, pashat ashalovash, connect pshita to levisha. Just levisha requires a kiddush, likewise pshita. Continues the Gemara. Amar mar. That's one of the girses on the side as those words. Amar mar. Let's just go back again and analyze the entire Bryce. So we concluded the Brysa. We have a makar for chiv tefillah. Every time you switch from one avodah to the other, from one set of clothes to the other, for a total of 5 tefillahs. We have a makar for the 10 times kiddush yadayim raglayim, 2 per tefillah. What are the sources for these things? We have 2 approaches. We have Rebbe, we have Rabbi Yehuda. Continues the Gemara, Amar. Let's go back to the Bryce. Rabbi Yehuda menai nochamesh tefillas v'asar kiddushin shetoy v'lkayin gadol mekadosh b'mayom. How do we know that there are 5 tefillas and 10 kiddushin on Yom Kippur? Talmud Laimar. The pasuk says, and this is pasuk chav gimel, uba Aaron Eloi l'moed v'rachas es b'sar b'mayim b'malkam kadosh. So Aaron HaKohen comes to El Moed and he removes the begadim. And pasuk chav dalet says v'rachatz es b'sar b'mayim b'malkam kadosh, and continues the words v'lavash as begadav. We learn from here, when you switch into begadav, these are the standard bigdei kahuna for kohen gadol bigdei zav. We need to be toivel halamanta shukal hameshanim avoid la'avoida ton tefillah. When you switch from one avoid to the other, from one set of clothing to the other, a tefillah is in place. Ashechan maybe bigdei lav and the bigdei zav. Okay, you learn from this pasuk that switching into bigdei zav v'lavash as begadav, that is mechayev tefillah. But when bigdei zav the bigdei lav and minayin. But how do you know that if he switches from zav to lavan, a tefillah is required? So Marasum will conclude that he actually learns it from pasuk dalet, the same makar as Rebbe, that switching into bigdei lavan requires tefillah. But until we get to that point, we're going to go through some stages here. Says the Gemara, okay, let's perhaps present the Kal V'chomer to teach us. This is according to Yehuda, that going into bigdei lavan requires tefillah. Tana der b'shmal Kal V'chomer. Ma bigdei zav she'ein koyin nichnas behen lifnai lifnim. Ton tefillah. Since we find that when he switches to bigdei zav, he requires a tefillah, despite the fact that we find some deficiency when it comes to bigdei zav. They don't enable him to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. They don't have that power. Still, we see they're chashav enough to require a tefillah. Certainly, the bigdei lavan she'nichnas behen lifnai lifnim. The bigdei lavan which enable him to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. They seem to have an added advantage. They stand higher than the bigdei zav. Of course, ein din sheton tefillah. Of course, a tefillah is required. Says the Gemara, not so fast. Ikel mifrach. You can perhaps refute the Kal V'chomer. Mal bigdei zav sheken kaparasa meruba. Perhaps bigdei zav They have an added advantage. They are considered superior to Bigdei Lavan because Kaparos and Meruba. They accomplish a lot of Kapara. They're active throughout the year. So perhaps they actually stand higher than the Bigdei Lavan, which are specific only to Yom Kippur. And just because we find a tefillah when you switch it to Bigdei Zav doesn't mean a tefillah will apply when you switch into Bigdei Lavan. So once again, how does Rabbi Yehuda know that when you switch into Lavan, a tefillah is required? Ella, nafkalim with the Rebbe. Apparently Rabbi Yehuda will source this halacha from the same pasuk as Rebbe. This is pasuk Daled. Ksoines bat kodesh yilbash, Bigdei kodesh heim, v'rachatz es pesore b'mayim ulaveshim. That when you switch into the ksoines bad, you need to be toivel. So when it comes to the tefillah, when you switch it to Bigdei Zav, he learns that from pasuk Chav Daled. V'rachatz es pesore b'mayim b'makom kodesh, v'lovesh es begadah. When it comes to switching it to Bigdei Lavan, he agrees with Rebbe. The makar is pasuk Daled. Ksoines bat kodesh yilbash. Let's proceed with the price. Amar Rebbe. So what does Rebbe tell us? Minai in the Chamesh Tfilos. How do I know that Kohen Gadol does 5 Tfilos and 10 Kedushin? He had a different approach than Rabbi Yehuda. Let's look at the pasuk, which says Ksoines bad kodesh yilbash. This is pasuk Daled. Ksoines bad kodesh yilbash. Ubichnese bad yoab soroi, ubeavnit bad yacher, b'snefes bad yitznoi, big day kodesh heim. What does the pasuk say? Tefillah is required when you switch into those begadim. V'rochas b'mayim s'b'sori levesha. Hala mata, we learn from here. Shukal ha'mishanim avoid lavoida. Whenever he switches avoidas, he switches into a new set of begadim. Shadon tefillah is in place. Well, that only explains the makar for tefillah when he switches into lavan. Ashichan b'bigdei zav l'bigdei lavan. So when he switches from Zav to Lavan, 8 tefillah is required, as stated in this pasuk. Ksoines bad kodesh yilbash. These are Bigdei Lavan, which he's putting on. However, Bigdei Lavan and Bigdei Zav minai. What if he's switching from Bigdei Lavan to Bigdei Zav? How do we know that that also requires a tefillah? So actually, earlier in the daf, we had extra words. Bigdei kodeshim. In pasuk Dal, we have those words. Bigdei kodeshim would seem to be extra words, and that actually is going to be the mokeh for Rebbe. Compare the Bigdei Lavan to Bigdei Zav. Just as switching into Lavan requires tefillah, likewise Zav, we don't differentiate. Before we get to that point, the Gemara will present another option. So again, we're looking for the mokeh for tefillah when switching into Bigdei Zav. Tanat Rebbe Shmuel Kavachomer. Let's present another Kavachomer, going in the other direction, similar to the previous Kavachomer, but just in the other direction. Ma Bigdei Lavan Shein Kaparos Meruba to Unin Tefillah. Since we find that switching into Bigdei Lavan, despite the fact they don't have the same advantage, the same power as Bigdei Zav, they're uniquely Yom Kippur begadim, very limited, has a very limited capacity. And Kaparos Meruba, still to Unin Tefillah, they require a Tefillah, as we just concluded from pasuk Dalet. Ksoines bad kodesh yilbash, v'rochas b'mayim s'v'saroi. Of course, says the Gemara, Bigdei Zav shekaparos meruba. Bigdei Zav that have more power, they accomplish kapara throughout the entire year. Ein edin shetuna tefillah. Of course, when you switch into them, tefillah is in place. Says the Gemara, but you can refute this kavachaim. Ikel mifrach. You can say, well, mal Bigdei Lavan. Perhaps Bigdei Lavan stand higher, and that's why they require tefillah. You know why? Because they are the ones that enable the Kohen Gadol to enter and to avoid in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, something which Bigdei Zav cannot accomplish. So perhaps tefillah is required when you get into the Bigdei Lavan, but not necessarily when you switch into Zav. So where's the marker for tefillah when you switch into Zav? Hainu diktani. That's a pshat. Why Rebbe in the Brisa added these words. He said, V'oimer, after you brought the pasuk Dalet, which tells us tefillah when you switch into Lavan, Rebbe added a couple of words, which up until this point we didn't really understand. What was he adding? V'oimer, the pasuk includes Bigdei kodesh heim, v'rachatz es psorei b'mayim. V'rachas b'mayim es b'soroi ulevesha. What was the point of Rebbe concluding with that statement? Very pashut. He was pointing out to us. Well, what's the pasuk saying? Big day kodesh Hashem. We know these are big day kodesh. The pasuk is simply trying to equate all the different sets of begadim, one to another. Just as we have to be toivel when we get into the big day lavan, the same halacha will apply to big day zav. So, conclusion: Rebbe derives both halachas from the same pasuk. This is pasuk Dalet. Pasuk Dalet tells us when you switch it to lavan, tefillah is required. The fact that the pasuk adds these words, big day kodesh Hashem, what does that tell us? All begadim were created equal. Whether you're switching into lavan or to zav, you need to be teifel. Let's proceed with the brayso. V'chamesh avodas. This leaves us with 5 transitions, 5 different sequences, different steps in the avodah. We begin with Tamid Shachar, which we'll do on Big Day Zav. We switch over to the avodah Sayai, Big Day Lavan. Then back to Eilev Eilam, Big Day Zav, is avodah Chutz. We go back inside for the Kafel Machta, Big Day Lavan. And finally, Tamid Sheben Abayim, Big Day Zav. So we've come to the point, we found a clear marker for the Chiv Tvila, whether you're switching into Big Day Lavan or into Big Day Zav. Continues Rabbi, what about the marker for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim? Uminayin shekol Tvila Tvila. Tzricha Beis Kiddushin. From where do we learn that every Tvila needs to be accompanied by 2 times Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim Tamad Laimar? Now we jump over to Pasuk Chav Gimel and Chav Daled. Pasuk Chav Gimel has the word of Pasha. He removes the big day Habad, and the next pasuk Chav Daled begins with the word V'rachatz. Upashas V'rachatz. What does that teach you? That pshita, that switching out, removing begadim, generates Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. We proceed V'rachatz V'lavash. So we use the same word twice. We apply it back to a pashat for the first Kiddush on account of removing the old begadim. And we apply it going forward as well. V'rachatz V'lavash. That switching into the new set of begadim necessitate Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So this is Rebbe's makar for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, twice for every tefillah, twice for every switch over. Says the Gemara, one second. The words V'rachas es b'sar b'mayim is generally a reference to tefillah and a mikveh, not to Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. Hay b'tefillah ksiv. It says V'rachatz es b'sarei, his entire flesh, entire guf, not just hands and feet. Hay b'tefillah ksiv. These are words which are generally associated with tefillah. How can we learn Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim from it? Says the Gemara, Im eina ina l'tefillah. Because if it's not needed for tefillah, then nafkel mi big day kodesh. We already learned tefillah from the other pasuk down. Tneu ina the kiddush. That's the case. Let's apply it to kiddush. This is a formula that we apply very often in Shas. If there's a pasuk unneeded for the more obvious purpose, if it's unneeded, it's unnecessary, we apply it for a different halacha. And indeed, this forms the source of this halacha of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, why can't the pasuk simply describe it as Kiddush? Why is the pasuk using cryptic language, referring to Kiddush, but using Tefillah terminology? Hakamashmon, the pasuk is trying to tell you another halacha. The Tefillah ki Kiddush. Although we're describing Kiddush, but we're using Tefillah terms to tell you that Tefillah on Yom Kippur must be similar, must resemble the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. In what way? Ma Kiddush b'makam Kaddish. Just as Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim certainly take place where? In the Azara. Because look at the pasuk. Pasuk of Dalet says, "V'rachatz es b'sarei b'mayim b'makam Kaddish." So we just concluded the pasuk is referring to Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim b'makam Kaddish. You take water from the kir, you wash your hands in a makam Kaddish. Af Tefillah b'makam Kaddish. The same thing applies to Tefillah throughout Yom Kippur. So that's why the pasuk uses Tefillah terminology when describing Kiddush, to tell you he wants to apply this aspect of Kiddush to Tefillah as well. Tefillah is also included in this halacha of a Makom Kaddish. Just as Kiddush takes place in Makom Kaddish, all the Tefillahs that he'll do, all Tefillahs that Kohen Gadol will do Yom Kippur, except for the first one, of course, which is meant to prepare him for the entry into the Azara. But everything else will take place in Makom Kaddish. So now we've concluded the Rebbe's approach. He learns Tefillah from Pasuk Dalet. Whether we're switching it to Big Day Lavan or Big Day Kodesh, it's irrelevant. Tefillah is required. Twice Kiddush per Tefillah is required because we have a Pashat V'rachatz. That's number one. V'rachatz V'lavash, that's number two. Says the more Rabbi Yehuda Kiddush Menali. Rabbi Yehuda, who learned the halacha of Tefillah from Pasuk Chav Gimel Chav Dalet, as we explained earlier. Those psukim are no longer available for Kiddush. So how does he know that a Kohen must rinse his hands and feet from the Kiyar upon transitioning from one set of Gadim to the other? Nafkele to Rabbi Shimon. Very simple. He learns it from the same place that Rabbi Shimon learned it from, which was the Kal V'chomer. Kal V'chomer was, throughout the year. Although a tefillah is not required for the Kohen Gadol entering the Azara, in Torah there's no tefillah, but still Kiddush is required. Certainly on Yom Kippur, when tefillah is required, when he's switching from one avodah to the next, Kiddush is required as well. That explains the Kiddush upon Levisha. Entering the avodah, approaching the avodah. What about Kiddush for removing the old begadim? So we have those extra words in the Pasuk Chav Gimel. Pasuk says that he removes the begadim, a pasha that's big abad lavash. Of course, you can only remove something you're wearing. The extra wording in the pasuk is coming to tell us that pshita and levisha go together, just as levisha requires a kiddush. Likewise, pshita. So in summary, from which psukim do we learn that the Kohen Gadol is toivel prior to switching into Big Day Lavan, which happens twice a day, or into Big Day Zav, which happens 3 times on Yom Kippur? When it comes to Big Day Lavan, all agree. Let's learn from Pasuk Dalet. Ksenis Bad Kodesh Yilbash, Big Day Kodesh Heim, V'rachas B'mayim Es B'Sarei Levesham. When you switch into Bad, into white, you do Tefillah. What about into Big Day Zav? Rebbe learns it's from the same Pasuk. The words Big Day Kodesh Heim indicate that all begadim are equal. You do Tefillah whether you're switching into white or into gold. Rebbe learns Big Day Zav from Pasuk Chav Dalet. V'rachas es b'sarei b'mayim b'makom kodesh. V'lavash es b'gadav, his ordinary clothing, his big days of, requires a tefillah. From where do we learn Kiddush? Well, the Kiddush for Levisha, which happens 5 times a day, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is learned from a Kal V'chomer. Since throughout the year, although there's no tefillah required, Kiddush is required. Certainly Yom Kippur, where he's toivel, of course he has to do a Kiddush as well. That's how you learn Levisha. What about Pshita? Well, the Pasuk Chav Gimel says, Upashat as big day, but Asher Lavash, the ones that he wore. Of course, you can't undress something which you weren't wearing. The Pasuk here is connecting Pshita to Levisha. Just as Levisha requires Kiddush, Pshita as well. So you learn a double Kiddush. According to Rebbe, it's learned from Pasuk Chav Gimel Chav Dalet. We have the word Upashat, then V'rachatz, followed by V'lavash. What does that tell you? That V'rachatz applies to Pshita, one Kiddush on account of undressing, and one Kiddush on account of dressing. So we learn a double Kiddush from that pasuk. And that leads us into the next Gemara. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chisda, Ha the Rebbe, this limud of Rebbe, Pashat, V'rachatz, and it says, it would say V'rachatz twice. Pashat, V'rachatz, and V'rachatz V'lavash. What does that tell you about the sequence? It seems that both times Kiddush happens when he's undressed. He's Pashat, he washes twice, and then his Lavash. How the Rebbe, this sheet of Rebbe apparently is inconsistent. Mapka Midrab Meir is not in line with Rav Meir's sheet as far as the sequence of events. Mapka Midrabban, and is not in line with the Rabban as well. Because yesterday we had a discussion as far as the Seder. According to Rabbi Meir, he would switch out of the begadim, do Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, put on new begadim, and do Kiddush again. According to Rabbanon, he does Kiddush when he's dressed. Kiddush, undress, get dressed again, and do Kiddush again. Rebbe has a third shita, that both Kiddush takes place when he's undressed. He undresses, twice Kiddush, and then gets dressed again. Says the Gemara, Ma'ab Kumad Rabbanon. Rebbe doesn't seem to be in line with the Rabbanon. The Ilu Rabbanon, because they hold Kshu Lavish Makadish. The Kiddush only takes place when he's wearing clothing. The Iu Hamar, whereas Rebbe holds Kshu Poishat Makadish. Kiddush takes place when he's undressed. Ma'ab Kumad Rameir. And likewise, he's inconsistent with Rav Meir. Dealer of Meir Amar, because Rav Meir holds, Kiddush Basha. At least the second Kiddush takes place when? Kshur Lavish. When he's already wearing the new set of begadim. Kshur Lavish Mekadosh. V'yu Amar, as Rebbe holds, Kshur Paishat Mekadosh. That the Kiddush, both of them, takes place when he's already undressed. So it's a brand new Shita. Amar B'acha Bar Yaakov. I disagree. All Shitas agree that the second Kiddush takes place once he's already wearing the begadim. Hakol Moedim, all agree, even Rebbe agrees. The Kiddush Shena, when it comes to the second Kiddush, Shaloivish V'achach Mekadosh. First he puts on the new set of begadim and then does Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim. My time Damakra. Why? Because the pasuk says, Oy Begishtam El Mezbeach. The Kohanim do Kiddush when they're approaching, when they're about to approach the Mezbeach. That's the last phase of preparation. Misha Eidem Mechusa La Gisha. We're speaking about a fellow who's only lacking Gisha. He's holding at the point of approaching the Mizbeach. Yotzeh as opposed to this fellow who has yet to get dressed. Shemechusa Labisha Vegisha. He's still 2 steps behind. He has to get dressed and approach the Mizbeach. Kiddush is not conducted at that point. So first you get dressed. And the last and final phase of preparation is the Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim. So even Rebbe agrees that Kiddush number 2 takes place only once dressed. Amali Rav Acha B'Rava Rav Ashi. He told Rav Ashi like this. This leads us to the following equation. Loi Rav Chizda is like Rav Acha. Apparently Rav Chizda was the one that said, according to Rebbe, twice Kiddush will take place when he's undressed. He undresses, does twice Kiddush, and then gets dressed. That's Shittas Rav Chizda. He can't hold like Rav Acha, who was the one who just told us that the Kiddush will take place once dressed. Because then you'll have 3 times Kiddush per Tefillah, which doesn't work. So that can't work. Rav Chizda can't hold a Rav Acha, and likewise, V'lo Rav Acha is like Rav Chizda. Nor can Rav Acha, who was the one who just told us that Kiddush takes place once dressed. He can't follow Rav Chizda, who held that according to Rebbe, you wash twice between undressing and dressing. When he is undressed, he washes twice. Because in that case, he'll have 3 times Kiddush. Twice undressed, and once after dressing. Tim Kain. Because if each Shita holds of the other, L'Rebbe havulei chamesa Kiddush. Going to Rebbe, you'll end up with 15 times Kiddush. 3 per Tefillah. We know there's only a total of 10. So apparently, Rav Chizda can't hold of Rebbe, of Rav Acha, nor can Rav Acha follow Rav Chizda. So in conclusion, we have Shittas Rav Meir holds that you're Poshet, the old begadim, then you do Kiddush in honor of the new begadim, you're Loivish, and then you're Mekadosh. According to Rabbanon, you do Kiddush, you're Poshet, and then you're Loivish, and you're Mekadosh. Rav Chizda was Mekadosh, according to Rebbe. Both Kiddushin take place when he's undressed. He's Poshet, he's Mekadosh, and then Poshet. Continues the Gemara, Hevilos, Hatamid, Krotze, V'chulu. The Mishnah tells us that they presented the Kohen Gadol, the Korban Tamid, and he did some sort of Shechita Krotze. What does Krotze mean? My Krotze. Amar Ula Lishna de K'talo. It's a lotion of killing the animal. Amar Nachmar Yitzchak, Mikra. Where do you find the lotion Krotze in a pasuk? Egla Yifefia Mitzrayim Keret Mitzafain Bava. Mitzrayim was this nice calf, and a keret on Tzafin came along. Well, what does this mean? My mashma. How do you see it from this pasuk? Where do you see the definition of the word carrots? Targum Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef presented the Targum on this pasuk and explained it as follows: the pasuk means Malka Yoi Hava Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was this pleasant and strong malchus and empire, and Hashem struck it down. Amamin, Katoilin, these killer nations, Mitzipuna Yason Allah will descend on it from the north. They'll destroy Mitzrayim. So Keret Mitzafin Ba means killer nations. Nations who will come to destroy. Keret means to kill. So the Kohen Gadol did some sort of maas or shchita which killed the animal. Why do we use the lashon krotze? Apparently, we're coming to teach us something. That he didn't do a complete shchita. As Rashi in the Mishnah said, he couldn't do a complete shchita because he himself had to do the Kabbalah. He only did a partial shchita. He did up until the point where it was an acceptable, halachically acceptable shchita. And then proceeded to the Kabbalah. That's what we call it krotze. Krotze bekama. How much did he cut? Amar ula b'roiv shnayim. The behemoth has 2 simanim, the esophagus and the trachea, the windpipe. In order to do a shchita, you have to shecht both simanim. He did roiv of each siman, which is sufficient to be considered a shchita. V'chein Rabbi Yehuda roiv shnayim. V'after shlokish sava roiv shnayim. He as well learned that that's pshat in the Mishnah. Kratze means he did most of the siman. Where do we see that in Rish Lakish? Dam Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish explains a Mishnah in Chulin. The Mishnah in Chulin tells us that although behema needs to have both simanim shechted, because the Gemara says a behema has stronger tchiyas, he comes from the earth, he's more resistant and it takes more to shecht him. You have to do both simanim, whereas an oif, which was created from the mud, rakak, only one siman is enough. And the Mishnah tells us you don't have to complete the whole siman. Even roiv is enough. Ruba kikula. And Rish Lakish had a kash. Since the Mishnah already tells us, Ruba shel echad kamay. If he did most of the siman, that's enough. Lama shanina, why then does the Mishnah repeat itself? And go into more specifics. When it comes to an oif, it's roiv echad ba'oif. That's considered a shchita. When it comes to behema, it's roiv shnayim behema. You have to do most of two. We know, shchita behema is 2, and roiv works. Shchita ba'oif is 1, roiv works. Why does the Mishnah have to repeat itself? Roiv of echad b'yoif, roiv shnayim behema. The answer is because perhaps by kachim, roiv is not enough. The point of kachim is not just to shech the animal, but to remove the dam. That's the ikka purpose of the shchita. And perhaps roiv is not enough. That's why the Mishnah repeats itself. Even by kachim, roiv is enough. Since we learned in the Mishnah Yom, they presented the korban tamid to the kohen gadol. Kuratzai, he only did kuratzai, he did only roiv. Umirek acher, another kohen came along. Umirek, he completed the shchita al yada, the shchita on his behalf. V'kibbas hadam, the kohen proceeded to do kabbalas hadam. V'zrakai, he did the shvika. Yachal, perhaps I would say, loy mirek, he apostle. If nobody completed the shchita, would he apostle? Because it's a carbon, and a carbon needs to be completely shechted to allow the dam to come out in full force. And that's why the Mishnah Chulin has to stress, no, regardless of whether it's Chulin or Kachim, roiv is enough. The Gemara stops the statement in its tracks. What do you mean? You would think perhaps without miruk it's possible? You have to complete the shchita to be considered an avodah? Yachal lo yimiruk ye apostle? How can you suggest that? Because look, who's completing it? The Kohen Hedid. If it's needed halachically, then it wouldn't work. Im kain havi le'avodah ba'acha. Because who's completing it? Who's doing the miruk, the finishing touch on the shchita? An acher, a kohen hedid. But Tani, we learned in the Brisa, kol avodah shemek Yippurim. All the avodas throughout Yom Kippur einam ksheris elaboy. Can only be done by kohen gadol. So you can't even suggest that the completion, the miruk, is mandated, because if that would be the case, the carbon would be puzzled. No, this is what he meant to say. Midaraisa, of course, it's good. Roiv is fine. Perhaps since it's a carbon, midrabanan, you need to do the entire shchita, entire siman. Roiv is not enough because you have to get the whole dam out. We pasul midrabanan. So of course, it's not chiv and Torah. So it's not considered the avodah Yom Kippur, and even a kohen hedid can do it. But you need to do it midrabanan, otherwise the carbon is pasul. Because again, the point by kachim is to take out the dam. Is that so? Is it required? Does it invalidate the carbon midrabanan? No. That's why the Mishnah Chum repeats itself. Roiv echad ba'oif. Roiv of one siman by oif is enough. Roiv shnayim b'behema. Roiv of both simanim by behema is enough. And we're coming to include even kachim. Not only does this apply to chulin, but even to a carbon which the point is to be moitz the dam, even roiv is enough. Says, well, if that's the case, if you just concluded that there isn't even a psul midrabanan by kachim, roiv is enough, even midrabanan. Lama li lamarik. So why then does the Mishnah tell us that the kohen hedid approaches the carbon and completes the shchita? What's the purpose? Mitzvah lamarik. It's a mitzvah chatchila to do so. Complete the shchita, cut all the way through, which allows a full force of dam. This allows him to be makabel the entire dam of the entire carbon. So conclusion, a behema needs 2 simanim shechted. If one roiv works, whether it's in chulin, whether it's in kachim, by kachim there's a mitzvah to cut all the way through to allow for more dam to flow out. Okay, time for brief chazara. We learned that on Yom Kippur, Kohen Gadol will do 5 tefillos, 10 kiddushim. We learn it from the Chumash Sinai, based on psukim, as far as the sequence of the tefillos and kiddushim. We have various shittas as to the exact mekayros for this halach. All the best, Hatzlacha Rabbah.